Hello again, and welcome back to Ancient and Medieval World History. This is Chapter 5, and I'm delivering it to my students actually a day and a half late because it turned out to be much bigger and much more involved than the previous chapters have been. Now, there was roughly a millennium from the collapse of the Bronze Age through the period just before the start of the Common Era on our calendars. For many of the first modern historians, the modern profession of history kind of began in Germany in the second half of the 19th century. This was the earliest period that they were able to consider legitimately historical, because this was the period during which lots of written records became available that they could use as their sources. Later, other tools like archaeology and genetics and the things that we've been using became available. But these were the sources that were available to 19th century historians. And as we get closer to the present, of course, the number of written records grows almost exponentially. So due to that wealth of documents, as we get closer to our own times, we're going to slow down a bit and consider shorter periods of time each week. In a sense, this chapter is a sort of transition from moving very quickly and taking a very 50,000 foot view to coming down a bit and zooming in on the details. This made the chapter a little bit extra challenging to write, and it made it a little bit longer. So let's begin. After the collapse, not all of the civilizations that had existed in the Bronze Age ceased to exist. As I mentioned previously, several places didn't even have a collapse at all. So cultures in China and India and the Americas continued growing and changing. In the Mediterranean world, some new societies emerged in places that had been hardest hit by famine or invasion. Other regions, like Egypt and Mesopotamia, saw a change in dynasties or in ruling cities, but things probably didn't change that much for the regular people. Now, one note. You may have noticed that so far, in the previous chapters and the previous videos, I've been describing things as having happened a certain number of years ago. I've said things like the Bronze Age collapse happened about 3,200 years ago, instead of saying it happened around 1200 BCE. The reason for this is that I wanted to remind you of how long ago the events really were. There's an unconscious tendency, I think, not to add the 2,000 years of the Common Era when we think about these types of dates. And this can cause us not to really appreciate how long ago it was and the real ancientness. However, as we enter this fully historical period on either side of the BCE-CE shift, and I'm calling it BCE, before the Common Era, and CE, the Common Era, because I don't want to reference any particular religious faith, although it's obvious where these numbers come from. Even so, I'm going to start using these designations. Sometimes I might also remind you how long ago that is. And of course, because of the time period that we're talking about right now, whenever I give dates, they will be BCE, before the Common Era. In what became Greece, the Mycenaean culture gave way to a new culture in what ancient historians such as Herodotus and Thucydides have called the Dorian invasion. Although the timeline and many of the details are still debated, there does seem to have been a kind of a dark age following a series of violent events that left burned ruins at sites like Mycenae and Tiryns and Pylos between about 1200 and 1100 BCE, or about 3,200 years ago. Population declined, and people seem to have retreated to small farming or fishing villages. Displaced Mycenaeans colonized Ionia in western Anatolia, what's now Turkey, and founded cities like Miletus. A new identity emerged among the Dorians, who migrated into Greece, in which the Hellenes imagined themselves to have been the true Greeks, who were coming back and reclaiming their ancestral homelands from barbarians. That term came from barbar, the Hellenic disparagement of the dialects that offended Dorian ears. Myths of returning Trojan war heroes, like Homer's Odyssey, also included the Nostoi, the returns, which told the stories of Agamemnon and Menelaus and Nestor and Orestes. Other legends described the adventures of the Trojan prince Aeneas and of the Greek hero Ajax. Other myths of invasion described as return include stories like Jason and the Argonauts, the Seven Against Thebes, and the Heraclidae, in which the descendants of Heracles return after generations to reclaim the kingdoms of Argos, Sparta, and Messene from tyrants ruling them. These stories all portray displacement as an epic quest and the trauma of relocation as a victory rather than as a defeat. The Dorians brought iron slashing swords, which were less expensive to produce than bronze arms and armor, and this allowed more common men to enter close-quarter battles. Along with the innovation in weapons, the Dorians also developed the hoplite phalanx, a dense formation of armored infantrymen who relied on spears and shields and discipline to shove their way through enemy ranks. The most effective fighters using these weapons and techniques were the Spartans. Sparta was a Dorian city-state, established around 1000 BCE on a Mycenaean foundation. The new rulers embraced the Homeric heroes and made the Mycenaean king Menelaus the divine protector of their own kings. The Spartans integrated only partly into the local population, and full citizens numbered only about 1,000 or 2,000 men, or including their families, about 10,000 people total. This was the top 5 to 10% of the whole population. Another quarter of the people of Sparta were free but disenfranchised people called periokoi, who worked as artisans or traders. Beneath them, nearly 3/4 of the people were helots, or state-owned serfs, who farmed communal lands and paid at least half of their produce as tribute to the ruling class. In order to keep control over the much more numerous native population, elite Spartan men devoted their entire lives to a military system that began at age 7 with brutal communal training in the agoge. Survivors of that became hoplite soldiers at age 20, lived in barracks until they were 30, and then remained in the reserves until they were 60, if they survived that long. Ironically, this focus on lifelong military service for elite men widened the scope of life for elite women. Not for all women, for elite women. Although the society was still patriarchal, elite women were able to manage their households and their estates, and even politics a little bit. Ancient sources such as Xenophon and Plutarch describe Spartan women as bold, athletic, and outspoken. They certainly would have been instrumental in supporting and continuing the warrior ethos. Aristotle thought this toughness degraded Spartan women's femininity, but he did give them credit for Sparta's resilience. Now, unlike the Mycenaean civilization of the Bronze Age, Greek in this new period did not have a high king. City-states, in Greek polises, controlled the rural regions surrounding them. Some of the important ones were Eleusis in northwest Attica, the island of Salamis, Marathon on the northeast coast, and Acharnae in the northwestern interior. On the Peloponnesian Peninsula, south of the Isthmus of Corinth, major city-states included Corinth, Argos, Megara, Messene, and Elis. These cities were typically much larger than their Attic cousins, and they were usually allied with Sparta. The most important polis, though, was in Attica, and it was Athens. Originally a hilltop Mycenaean village founded about 3,600 years ago, Athens survived the collapse, and it seems to have been largely ignored by the Dorians. Through its harbor at Piraeus, Athens traded with neighboring islands, with Etruria, the Etruscans in northern Europe, with Egypt, with the Levant, and with Sicily. Later in its history, this trade would extend to Thrace and into the Black Sea. Maritime commerce not only made up over half of the polis's economy by the beginning of the classical period, it also exposed Athenians to Ionian and more distant ideas, including the Phoenician alphabet. The alphabet was developed by 1050 BCE from Egyptian hieroglyphs and the Proto-Canaanite language. The 22-letter collection of phonetic consonants was adopted by the Athenians, who added vowels around 800 BCE, and then by the Aramaeans, and later by the Latins. Athens also borrowed from the Dorians, though, especially the hoplite military formation. The Phoenicians had also survived the Bronze Age collapse, although not without serious damage. The civilization that had begun with Byblos over 7,000 years ago lost major centers such as Ugarit. But Byblos and the island fortress of Tyre persisted and then prospered. The Phoenician population rebounded to 250,000, and trade with Egypt, trading cedar for gold, resumed. By 1100 BCE, the Phoenicians had established colonies at Utica, in what's now Tunisia, and Gadir, or Cadiz, in Spain. Tyre's sister city, Sidon, became the center of an extremely lucrative trade in purple dye made from snail shells, in a process that the Phoenicians, whose name actually means purple people, kept a close secret to preserve their monopoly. About 969 BCE, King Hiram I is said to have allied with Solomon's kingdom of Israel and Judah, and to have provided the cedars used in the building of Solomon's first temple. By some accounts, the Phoenicians built it. Although others, such as the Etruscans and the Athenians, had formidable navies, and the competing cities of Tyre and Sidon were often threatened and sometimes conquered militarily, the Phoenicians dominated trade on the Mediterranean. In addition to Utica and Gadir, their colonies and trading posts spanned about 3,000 miles, and by 800 BCE included over 40 major locations, including Nora in Sardinia, established 1000 BCE, Lixus in Morocco, also 1000 BCE, Kition in Cyprus, 900 BCE, Panormus, now called Palermo in Sicily, 800 BCE, and Matia, also in Sicily, in 800 BCE. Also, about 814 BCE, or nearly 2,850 years ago, the mythical Queen Dido, fleeing Tyre's tyrannical King Pygmalion, her brother, founded Carthage. This new city, and its name literally means new city, was located about 15 miles from the older settlement at Utica. The Tunisian coast lies directly across the Mediterranean from Sicily, at a narrow spot that all ships traveling from east to west would have to pass. 2 large harbors were built, one for the city's powerful navy and another one for commerce. Carthage rapidly became a very wealthy center of trade and culture, and the Carthaginian Republic was one of the largest and longest-lasting states of the ancient Mediterranean. The social structure of the city seems to have been built around commerce, and elite formed from nobles of originally Tyrian families was led in a large part by women in the style of Queen Dido, and ruled over a merchant middle class and over Libyan serfs. The people worshipped the Phoenician or Punic deities Tanit, a fertility goddess, and Baal, a sky god, although it seems there were no large temples in the early city. Now, the sky god Baal is probably best known to modern readers from derisive mentions of it in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Tanakh. The early Hebrews entered Canaan about 3,200 years ago and absorbed many elements of the local culture, but developed a hatred of the rival to their own deity, whom they did not name. A lot of the story of the ancient Hebrews comes from their own book, and some of their claims lack archaeological evidence or third-party corroboration. For example, since there are not that many signs of conflict, such as burning or mass graves, at a lot of the ancient sites where the Bible claims there were decisive battles, many historians believe that the Hebrews entered and assimilated gradually and kind of gently, rather than conquering Canaan. Now, one cultural practice that distinguished the Hebrews from their neighbors, and that's easy to trace, was a dietary restriction against eating pigs. According to archaeologists, by about 1100 BCE, villages had been established in the Levant by people who shunned swine. Over the next century, a loose confederation of these, who probably identified themselves tribally, began to fight their Canaanite and their Philistine neighbors. Philistines were other people who had settled in the area, who were descended from the Sea Peoples. After a conflict that they nearly lose, according to the biblical story, these tribes are then united under Saul, the first king, in 1020 BCE. His successor David expands the kingdom, capturing Jerusalem in 1004 BCE. And then David's son Solomon is said to have ruled from 970 to 931 and to have ordered the building of the first temple, with, as I said, Phoenician materials and possibly Phoenician help. Now, we'll look more closely at their beliefs in a bit, but for now, let's focus on the Hebrews' history. After the death of Solomon, the Hebrew kingdom is split into Israel and Judah. Israel, with its capital at Samaria, was criticized for falling into the worship of calves and of Baal, and was conquered by the Assyrians in 722 BCE. The southern kingdom, Judah, with its capital at Jerusalem, maintained the Davidic dynasty, but was criticized by prophets like Isaiah when the rich began oppressing the poor. Judah was conquered by the Babylonians in 586 BCE, and Solomon's temple was destroyed. The Hebrew elites and a significant portion of the population was then relocated to Babylon in what is known as the Babylonian captivity. King Nebuchadnezzar, or Nebuchadrezzar II, deported about 10,000 Hebrew elites, including the prophet Ezekiel, to Babylon in 597, and then probably a similar or greater number in 586 BCE. Common Judean people remained at home under Babylonian occupation. The captivity continued until Babylon was conquered in its turn by the Persian Empire in 538 BCE. The first Persian emperor, Cyrus the Great, released the Hebrews, helped many of them return to their homelands, while many other moved to Persian cities such as Isfahan, and helped them rebuild the temple. Despite the rebuilding of Solomon's temple, the captivity shifted Hebrew religious practice from temple worship to a focus on community or synagogue practice. The emphasis on prayer, study, and on the communal reading of scriptures created a new faith centered on personal piety rather than temple ritual. And although they had been relatively autonomous in Babylon, and overachievers like Daniel had even become very important in the royal court, the trauma of exile redefined the Judean people as Jewish, people who would begin to identify themselves by their faith rather than by the place where they lived. Being surrounded by polytheistic Mesopotamians also probably helped strengthen what would become the monotheism of the people and led them to compile their stories into the Torah and their cultural practices into the laws of its fifth book, Deuteronomy. The ruler who freed the Jews from Babylon was Cyrus II, also known as Cyrus the Great. He lived from about 600 to 530 BCE and is remembered not as much as a military conqueror, although he did fight many battles and he died in battle in 530, but as a diplomatic genius who gained power by co-opting local elites, respecting local cultures and religions, and who brought peace and commerce. Cyrus conquered Babylon bloodlessly and became a sort of patron of the Jews. And this relationship may have enhanced the influence of Cyrus's religion, Zoroastrianism, on the development of Jewish monotheism, as we'll discuss shortly. Cyrus also planned and began building infrastructure, like the Royal Road. This was a network of paved highways reaching from Persepolis and Ecbatana Cyrus's new capital, to Susa near Mesopotamia, Babylon, and Sardis in western Anatolia. Travel along this road was so fast and dependable that the ancient Greek historian Herodotus said, "Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds." Yes, Herodotus invented the motto of the United States Postal Service while talking about this Persian road. Now, the Achaemenid or Persian Empire is probably best known to Westerners for the 300. From 492 to 479 BCE, the Greeks fought the Persians. Its third king, Darius I, reigned for 36 years, unified the empire, extended the royal road, and conquered the Indus Valley and Thrace, the region north of the Bosphorus Strait and south of the Balkans. Ionian city-states revolted with Athens' support and burned the Anatolian city of Sardis in 499 BCE. Persia retaliated in Thrace with mixed success, but then invaded Greece. A Greek force led by Athens won a victory at the Battle of Marathon, and Phidippides famously ran 26 miles from Marathon to Athens to tell the people. And then Athens built a navy of 200 trireme ships. The Persian crown prince, Darius' son, Xerxes I, led about 200,000 troops to Greece in 480. The Persian force was temporarily held up at the pass of Thermopylae by 300 Spartans led by their king, Leonidas, and about 7,000 other Greeks. And although the Greeks who sacrificed themselves at that battle in the pass only delayed the Persians by a few days, the battle boosted Greek morale and allowed the Greek navy to prepare for the Battle of Salamis, after the Persians had sacked Athens. In this naval battle, the more disciplined Greeks had better ships and a more detailed knowledge of the bay and the gulf in which they fought. The Greek fleet, led by Themistocles, captured or sunk about 300 Persian ships and killed about 30,000 sailors. Xerxes retreated to Anatolia with his remaining 400 ships. The Greeks liberated Ionia, and Persia paid a reparation to help rebuild the cities that they had destroyed. Athens entered its golden age and built the Parthenon. But the rivalry between Athens and Sparta intensified, leading to the Peloponnesian War from 431 to 404 BCE, which Sparta eventually won. Now, another of the royal road's extensions took it to Bactria, on the edge of the Hindu Kush. In India, the Indus Valley or Harappan civilization had ended between 3,900 and 3,700 years ago, as you may recall. Over the next few centuries, a new culture began to grow in that region, based on an ancient oral tradition known as the Vedas, which were finally written down after about 500 BCE. The earliest of these, the Rig Veda, is typically believed to have been originally composed about 1500 BCE and consists of 1,028 hymns that describe the gods, the creation of the world, and mythical history. The Vedas also lay out a caste system that divided Indian society into 4 classes, or varna: priests and scholars, warriors and rulers, merchants and farmers, and then laborers and servants. Hinduism, the religion that came out of the Vedas, has lasted to the present in India. But elements of the Vedic tradition, especially the castes, were challenged by religious figures known as renouncers, beginning about 600 BCE, leading to several new religions, which we will also cover shortly. At about this time, urbanization begins to resume and 16 kingdoms emerge, including Magadha, Kosala, Vasta, and Avanti. Iron swords become prevalent, as well as the use of elephants in infantry charges. Although Cyrus's Persians and later Alexander's Macedonians reached the borders of India, no foreign army invaded. Megasthenes, a Greek ambassador, reported that the Indians had a standing army of 600,000 infantry supported by 9,000 elephants. The commander of this massive army that Megasthenes reported on was the first ruler of a unified India, named Chandragupta Maurya, who lived from about 350 to about 297 BCE. The Mauryan Empire helped to spread the tenets of Buddhism, which we'll also discuss shortly, especially under its third emperor Ashoka, who ruled from 304 to 232 BCE. And his story is that after fighting an especially bloody battle in the eastern kingdom of Kalinga that killed hundreds of thousands, Ashoka embraced nonviolence and Buddhism. Ashoka erected pillars throughout his empire and had edicts carved on rocks or cliff faces to proclaim the new religious principles of his empire. The edicts were carved in several Indian dialects as well as Greek and Aramaic, which was the language of the Persian Empire. Further east, China's longest-lasting ruling house rose to power in 1046 BCE. The Zhou dynasty replaced the Shang by invoking the mandate of heaven for the first time. This is a principle that would legitimize rulers for nearly the next 3,000 years, asserting that the right to rule was demonstrated by positive outcomes in the world, like good harvests or a lack of natural disasters. Zhou control of the North China Plain continued until 256 BCE, and a feudal society developed of landed lords ruling over agrarian serfs. And beginning in the 8th century BCE, in the 700s, a class of scholars called Shi began to emerge, who became professional civil servants and court administrators. In the 3 centuries, called the Spring and Autumn period, beginning about 722 BCE, there were at least 148 recorded wars. So this was a very violent time, a war every 2 years. This led to a recognition of the value of educated strategists. One of these strategists was Sun Tzu, who lived from 544 to 496 BCE, who was a philosopher and a general, whose book, The Art of War, is still read today. Some of the ideas in it include all warfare is based on deception, and supreme excellence consists in breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting. Another Shi who gained eternal fame was a teacher named Confucius, who lived from about 551 to 479 BCE, whom we will discuss shortly. The end of the Zhou era is known as the Warring States period, beginning around 476 BCE. During this period, about 140 small autonomous states were reduced and consolidated to just a handful. Wealthy rulers were able to field larger infantry armies. For example, over 1 million conscripted soldiers fought in the Battle of Changping between 262 and 260 BCE, and about 650,000 of them were killed. The technological innovation that facilitated this type of mass killing was the repeating crossbow, which was invented sometime in the 4th century BCE in China. The victory at Changping of the Qin made them the most powerful of the 7 remaining warring states. The Qin were able to unify these remaining states in a series of campaigns between 247 and 221 BCE, when the Qin king, Yingzheng, claimed the mandate of heaven, which had been held by the weak Zhou monarch, and declared himself Emperor of China, Huangdi, a title that he invented. And we'll have a lot more to say about the Chinese Empire because it continued under several dynasties until 1911. On the other side of the world, in the Americas, a number of cultures flourished during the millennia before the Common Era. Along the lower Mississippi River, a hunter-gatherer population that had occupied a site which is now called Poverty Point since about 3,750 years ago, in an area that seemed to provide everything they needed, was beginning to fragment, and people were moving northward to form new cultures and to begin making ceramic pottery. One of these cultures, which we call Adena, lived along streams that fed into the Ohio River. They lived in semi-sedentary villages and built conical earthworks between 15 and 60 feet high, oftentimes over log tombs. A few centuries later, ancestral Puebloans in what's now the North American Southwest began to build pit houses around 700 BCE. In South America, ancestors of the Mochica at Huaca Prieta in Peru were making cotton textiles and digging early irrigation canals around 1000 BCE. In the Andes, archaeologists have found a site called Chavin de Huantar, where occupation began about 5,000 years ago. By 900 BCE, a temple had been built there, and the place had become a religious hub that seems to have unified dozens of cultures through pilgrimage. Farther south, along the Pacific coast, a culture called Paracas began about 800 BCE. A necropolis has been discovered there with over 108 shaft tombs, up to 30 feet deep, containing layered mummy bundles, some of them up to 40 layers, of bodies wrapped in textiles in fetal position. Living in a very, very arid region, the residents of this culture depended on the sea for up to 90% of their food. In Central America, the Olmec civilization rose about 3,500 years ago. Instead of a unified political structure, the Olmecs seem to have preferred to live in a decentralized network of ceremonial centers with populations between 10,000 and 20,000, built by farmers who grew corn and beans and squash. At their peak, around 900 BCE, Olmec trade networks extended over hundreds of miles, and their art included carved basalt heads weighing from 6 to 50 tons. The Maya civilization seems to have followed the Olmec, although it overlaps for a while, and seems to have adopted some of their culture. Early sites like Coelho in Belize date back to around 1200 BCE. Nakbe in Guatemala was established around 1000 BCE, and temple construction began around 750. The earliest known Maya pyramid may be the Temple of Masks at Uaxactun. Now we're going to change direction a little bit. Several times during this chapter, I've briefly mentioned a philosophy or a religion, and I've turned away, promising to return. Well, here we are. I wanted to wait and talk about all these ways of thinking together, because many of them seem to be related to each other, and because there's a long tradition of considering these particular philosophical and religious ideas as part of a group. This tradition began in the 19th century, but the most famous expression of it is in the idea of the Axial Age, developed by German psychologist and philosopher Karl Jaspers in a 1949 book called The Origin and Goal of History. Jaspers began his explanation of the Axial Age like this. And I took this quote from Wikipedia, so in the text version of this, I've left in all of the links. Jaspers said, Confucius and Lao Tse were living in China. All the schools of Chinese philosophy came into being, including those of Moti, Chuang-Tze, Lietzu, and a host of others. India produced the Upanishads and Buddha, and, like China, ran the whole gamut of philosophical possibilities down to materialism, skepticism, and nihilism. In Iran, Zarathustra taught a challenging view of the world as a struggle between good and evil. In ancient Israel, the prophets made their appearance, from Elijah by way of Isaiah and Jeremiah to Deutero-Isaiah. Greece witnessed the appearance of Homer, of philosophers Parmenides, Heraclitus, and Plato, of the tragedians, of Thucydides, and Archimedes. Everything implied by these names developed during these few centuries, and almost simultaneously in China, India, and the West. So the idea is that there was a kind of a moment in history, although it lasted several hundred years, when a lot of the philosophies and religions that we now think of as important were developed, sometimes more or less simultaneously. Now, this claim is really a stretch, but to the extent that some of these ideas do seem to have developed close together in time, it's interesting to look more closely at them and ask why. And in any case, these are some of the foundational philosophical and religious ideas that still influence our lives. And we'll be looking at them anyway throughout the rest of the semester. So let's begin. I'll try to take these chronologically, and I'm just going to mention the biggest ones. And actually, I'm going to pass over some of the ones that Jaspers just mentioned in that quote. The oldest is the Persian religion Zoroastrianism. It probably began about 3,500 years ago, but It seems to have been reformed between 800 and 600 BCE, which explains how it fits into Jasper's list. Zoroastrianism is named after its prophet, Zoroaster, whom Jaspers calls Zarathustra, and it's the first monotheistic religion. But its theology is dualistic. It's based on a war between good and evil. The singular god, Ahura Mazda, is locked in an eternal battle with an adversary named Angra Mainyu. As I mentioned, Cyrus the Great was a Zoroastrian, as well as the patron of the Jews that he freed from Babylon. Scholars believe that contact with Zoroastrianism, both in their interactions with the Persians while they were rebuilding the temple, and also through all of the Jews, up to 90% of them, who did not return and who remained in Persian lands. Although the Hebrews may already have been monolatrous, preferring their god to others such as Baal, they may have been inspired by the Persians to adopt full-on monotheism. The first commandment, after all, is, "You shall have no other gods before me." Now, while some people nowadays interpret this metaphorically, explaining that money or nationalism or materialism could be considered a rival god, it's also quite possible that its meaning might have been literal. Baal worship was apparently a big problem for Hebrews living in Canaan. And other evidence of Zoroastrian influence is found by some scholars in the adversary Satan and in ideas of paradise. The ideas that we identify today as Judaism seem to have been developed from a tribal period during which it focused on the covenant between YHVH, the Hebrew name for their god, which they don't pronounce, but which Americans sometimes call Yahweh, and Abraham, which established Abraham's clan as the chosen people. The Judges era stories, circa 1200 BCE, portray YHVH as a warrior god who will deliver them from oppression and will support them in their fight for a homeland. The Ten Commandments seem to emerge from these tribal laws focused on social justice and ritual purity. During the monarchy period, beginning 1020 BC, Solomon's temple was the center of worship, and the extended laws that came to be listed in Deuteronomy became central. The 5 books of the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, begin to take form. This chronology can be a little bit confusing, since the texts that were probably first written down between 900 and 600 BCE describe events like Moses giving a written law around 1300 BCE. This is one of the many ways that the claims of the Bible need to be understood in the context of their origins. And then later, in the Babylonian captivity, monolatry probably did move closer to monotheism as the Hebrews struggled to resist the prevalence in the society of Babylonian gods like Marduk. Ezekiel and Daniel's visions stress personal responsibility and messianic redemption. The covenant is reframed as a personal relationship with the divine, and faithfulness to YHVH, despite exile, begins to be valued. After contact with Persia, monotheism is further strengthened, and Judaism began to include dualism, and the serpent in Genesis begins to become an adversary of the Creator. The book of Job, which is written around 500 BCE, introduces Ha-Satan as the divine assistant, who's literally known as the one who accuses, who wagers with YHVH over the mortal's loyalty. In India, beginning about 800 BCE, a set of documents known as the Upanishads begin to challenge some Vedic traditions. Instead of Vedic rituals, new generations of sages try to begin using contemplation to free themselves from the illusion or Maya of the world. New ideas of Brahman, or impersonal, infinite, ultimate reality, and Atman, the inner soul, are imagined to be identical if one can transcend Maya. Karma is understood as actions and consequences that bind the soul into a cycle of rebirth, samsara, that the sages would like to transcend and liberate themselves from. That's called moksha. The Upanishads gently challenged the Varna system of castes, but only very gently. And one example of that is the only people allowed to actually read the texts were initiated priests of the highest Brahmin caste, or occasionally the second Kshatriya class. And they had to do this in the context of guru-disciple lineages. But gradually, these challenges begin to encourage an introspective, ethically oriented worldview that begins to abandon ritual. In the long run, this would lead to people withdrawing from worldly duties to become forest hermits and wandering renouncers and teachers. And this led ultimately to Mahavira and to the Buddha. Mahavira, who lived from 599 to 527 BCE, was an Indian prince who renounced his lifestyle at age 30 and founded the Jain religion. Believers say that he lived as an ascetic for 12 years before attaining Kevala Gnana, or omniscience. He went on to preach to the kings and merchants, mostly of his own kingdom. The center of Jain beliefs is ahimsa, or avoiding doing harm to any living being. This includes insects and even microbes. So Jains are vegans and are extremely careful when they walk. Monks sweep their paths, and they make 4 vows: nonviolence, truth, non-stealing, and celibacy. Jainism still attracts followers in India, where there are about 6 million Jains today. But it did not spread as much as Buddhism. Siddhartha Gautama, who lived from about 563 to 583 BCE, was born near the Indian border in what is now Nepal. Like Mahavira, he was the king's son, until at the age of 29, he renounced his life and left home. Siddhartha wandered as an ascetic, trying extreme practices unsuccessfully for 6 years, before he sat under a Bodhi tree and vowed not to rise until he had achieved his goal. After one night, he achieved enlightenment and became the Buddha. The core teaching of Buddhism is the 4 Noble Truths, which are this. First, that dukkha, or suffering, is the central reality of existence. Second, that suffering is caused by desire and attachment. Third, that attachment can be conquered and desire let go of. And fourth, that the way to achieve this is called the Noble Eightfold Path. This technique, which the Buddha called the middle way, rejected both Vedic indulgence and Jain extremism and advocated moderation. Its 8 elements were right view, which is understanding the 4 noble truths through study; right intention, which is cultivating loving kindness through meditation; right speech, avoiding gossip and promoting harmony; right action, non-violence, non-stealing, and chastity for monks; right livelihood, that is, having a harmless occupation, non-military; right effort, which is about guarding the senses and preventing negative thoughts; right mindfulness, which deals with awareness and meditation; and right concentration, which is about equanimity and insight. Buddhism spread rapidly. It rejected Vedic rituals, and it rejected the Varna castes, and it emphasized karma and ethics over birth. So Buddhism's moral teachings aligned with those of many rulers. Ashoka embraced it and put up his messages across India and sent envoys to Sri Lanka, which also became a Buddhist center. Organized monks and the community of believers, the Sangha, also attracted converts. And the lack of theology made the teachings seem more like a spiritual self-help practice than like a new religion. Buddhism reached China in the early years of the Han Dynasty that replaced the Qin at the head of the empire in 206 BCE. Long before this, however, the Chinese made 2 contributions to the Axial Age. The first, Taoism, Tao means the way, began in the 6th century BCE and paralleled Buddhism's middle way, blending philosophy with folk religion to find a serene response to the chaos of the times. The teaching comes in a book called the Tao Te Ching that contains 81 poetic chapters attributed to the sage Lao Tzu or Lao Tzu, supplemented by a book of parables by Shuangxi. The philosophy focuses on the ineffable, unexplainable nature of existence. For example, the way that can be spoken of is not the true or eternal way. And it prefers harmony to hierarchy. Taoism promotes spontaneity, simplicity, and inaction or non-action, called wu wei, over contrived effort. And it kind of forms a calm counterpoint to Confucianism. Confucius, who, as I mentioned, lived from about 551 to 479 BCE, was a shi, or a scholar civil servant, during the social chaos of the spring and autumn period. Although the scholars were already trying to rationalize Chinese society, Confucius focused on developing moral character, ren, or humaneness, through education, ritual etiquette, called li, and filial piety, zhao. The goal was to become a junsi, a gentleman or a sage. And this goal, he said, was achievable by any man, regardless of birth. Now, although he's known for the pithy aphorisms in 20 books of sayings compiled by his disciples, called the Analects, Confucius considered himself not really an innovator, but a collector of all of the best aspects of Chinese culture, which, of course, by this time was already ancient. The centerpiece, the central idea of Confucianism, is reciprocity, described in the Silver Rule. Do not do to others what you do not want done to yourself. And this became the foundation for ethics, even the ethics of rulers. Confucius traveled and taught for 30 years, but his thoughts really didn't catch on until after his death. Once they did, however, they became the basis for the civil service education that was already being taught to the scholars. Early in the Han Dynasty, the empire began incorporating Confucian content, and soon it dominated the examinations that were used to select administrators. Although there were times when the system was corrupted, subverted, or even temporarily abandoned, the Confucian civil service system became the foundation of the Chinese empire for most of its existence. Now, like Confucianism, Greek philosophy did not focus primarily on theology. The most significant Greek philosopher, in the opinion of later philosophers and historians, was Socrates, although Aristotle was a close second. In any case, the Greek philosophers are typically divided between the pre-Socratics and the post- or classical writers. So I'll mention some of the major thinkers, again in chronological order. Thales of Miletus in Ionia, or Anatolia, lived from 624 to 546 BCE, and is thought of as the first philosopher and the first person to shift from mythical thinking to observation of the natural world. He believed that water was the primordial substance. He predicted an eclipse in 585 BCE, and he developed geometrical theorems that would influence Pythagoras. Anaximander, who lived from 610 to 546, his contemporary in Miletus, was also interested in origins and suggested that humans had evolved from fishes. He wrote the first philosophical treatise. The third famous member of the Milesian school was Anaximenes, who lived from about 586 to 526 BCE. He also believed in monism, or a single fundamental element from which everything was made. But his choice was air. Not that much is known about his specific insights on winds and rain, because all of his writings have been lost, and we only know about him through what others have written about his ideas. Pythagoras, who lived from 570 to 495 BCE, was born on the Ionian island of Samos, but lived in Croton in Italy, and is best known for mathematical and geometric discoveries. In addition to the theorem that bears his name, he made contributions in music, He talked about the sphericity of the Earth and the identity of the morning and the evening stars as planets. Pythagoras may have been the first person to actually call himself a philosopher, a lover of wisdom. But he was also a mystic. He wrote about the mystical properties of mathematics and geometry, and he believed that the souls of the dead would enter new bodies after death, metempsychosis. Pythagoras was also politically active and rejected the idea of democracy in a disagreement with local people that led to violence and ultimately to his death. Heraclitus, who lived from 535 to 475 BCE, was another Ionian from Ephesus in Anatolia. And he focused on the unity of opposites, and especially on change. Heraclitus believed that fire was the fundamental component of the world, and is famous for writing, "No man ever steps in the same river twice." Heraclitus believed that harmony arose from strife, that becoming was much more significant than being, and that the world was ordered by logos, discourse or reason. Parmenides, who lived from about 515 to 450 BCE, lived in Elea in Italy, but according to Plato, visited Athens while Socrates was a young man, around 450 BCE, at the end of his life. His only known work is a philosophical poem that contradicts Heraclitus and claims that existence is timeless and uniform. The appearance of change, Parmenides proposed, was doxa, or illusory opinion, caused by faulty perception. Empedocles, 494 to 434 BCE, lived in Agrigento, in Sicily, and was called by Aristotle the father of rhetoric, which is high praise, because Aristotle wrote a whole book on rhetoric. He believed that humans had evolved from plants, and that all life had evolved from what he called slime. Empedocles is also credited with introducing the idea that the world was made of 4 roots, as he called them: earth, fire, air, and water. This idea, which was also developed independently in other parts of the world, dominated cosmology until the scientific revolution of the 17th century. The roots were moved, he said, by 2 divine powers, love and strife. And, like Pythagoras, Empedocles believed in the transmigration of the soul, or metempsychosis. Anaxagoras, who lived from 500 to 428 BCE, was born in Anatolia, but moved to Athens shortly after the Persian War. He's credited with bringing the spirit of inquiry to Athens. Anaxagoras disagreed with Parmenides on the impossibility of change and introduced the idea of nous, or cosmic mind, as an organizing force in the world. He was a friend and possibly the teacher of the Athenian statesman Pericles, and his political activities resulted in trial and ultimately in banishment. But before his banishment and subsequent death from starvation, Anaxagoras was an Athenian contemporary of Socrates. Although he wrote nothing himself, Socrates, who lived from 470 to 399 BCE, is generally considered the founder of Western philosophy. 2 of Socrates' pupils, the historian Xenophon and the philosopher Plato, wrote extensively about him. He's also mentioned by the comic dramatist Aristophanes, who was an Athenian contemporary, and by Aristotle, who was born after his death, but was Plato's student. Socrates is best known for his technique of asking questions, in a form that we still call Socratic dialogue. Nearly all of Plato's writings consist of conversations between Socrates and other men, in which the philosopher probes and digs, until he uncovers a flaw in the other's reasoning or a faulty premise that invalidates his argument. Although Socrates valued ethics over physics, and his motto, "The unexamined life is not worth living," is inspiring, it's easy to see how this constant questioning could become both an annoyance and a threat to the Athenian authorities. In 399, he was put on trial for corrupting the youth of Athens, and he was convicted. Offered a choice between banishment or death, Socrates chose to drink the hemlock. Plato recorded Socrates' defense of free inquiry at his trial, his loyalty to principles over survival, and his death, in dialogues called Apology, Crito, and Phaedo. Xenophon's Apology corroborates Plato's account. The Socratic method and the philosopher's choice of martyrdom shaped Western ethics. Plato, 428 to 348 BCE, was an Athenian and a student of Socrates. The trauma of his teacher's death fueled his hatred of democracy, which he considered mob rule. From 399 to 387, after the execution of Socrates, Plato traveled to Megara in Greece, Cyrene in Libya, and to Egypt. He began tutoring the tyrant of Syracuse in Sicily, which inspired him to imagine philosopher kings. And he studied Pythagorean mathematics in Italy, which helped him to develop a mysticism that may not have originated with Socrates. Returning to Athens in 387, he founded the Academy, which actually lasted about 900 years, to train philosophers, mathematicians, and statesmen. Plato's philosophy, which he expressed in 36 Socratic dialogues totaling over 1 million words, focused on universal truths and ethics, and has parallels to other traditions that we've talked about, including the Brahman of the Upanishads and the Confucian Ren. A central element is Plato's theory of forms, which is elaborated in the allegory of the cave in his book, The Republic. Plato claimed that reality existed as eternal, perfect archetypes, such as justice and beauty, but it was perceived as imperfect, temporary shadows, like those on a cave wall. Daily life, he said, was lived in this cave of illusions. But man's reason seeks the eternal forms. People had eternal souls, Plato taught, made of reason, logos, spirit, thumos, and appetite, epithumia. Virtue was equated with knowledge, and justice was understood as every soul playing its part. And to make all of this work in the world, Plato said that rulers would need to be philosophers, trained to recognize the good. Plato's most famous student, Aristotle, who lived from 384 to 322 BCE, was born in Macedonia, where he returned after Plato's death. Aristotle joined the Athenian Academy at age 17, and he left 20 years later. He then studied marine biology in Lesbos, a Greek island, tutored Alexander the Great in Macedonia, and returned to Athens in 325 to establish his own school, the Lyceum. He then fled anti-Macedonian riots after Alexander's death in 323 and died in Chalkis in Greece. Aristotle wrote over 200 treatises, only 30 of which survive, but they still run to about 1.5 million words, covering topics such as logic, ethics, politics, rhetoric, biology, physics, metaphysics, aesthetics, and poetics. The 10,000 scrolls in the Lyceum's library and the scientific demonstrations, like dissections, that he did, helped to create empirical science. Aristotle rejected Plato's dualism of forms and shadows and imagined the human as a unity of body and soul. He believed that flourishing was the goal of life and that it could be achieved through contemplation, theoria, and virtuous activity. Virtue was a balance between extremes, which he called a golden mean, and ethical living should be a matter of habit rather than of dogma. These ideas kind of parallel Buddha's middle way to some extent. The ideas of the Greek philosophers, of course, would be much more influential on the development of Western culture and religion than those of the East. But we'll follow the elaboration of all of these philosophies and ideologies in their own settings as we move forward and see how they influence the histories of different cultures. And with that, we've finally come to the end of this long chapter. So I hope you found that a little bit interesting. Thanks very much for watching, and I will see you again very soon.